So now we're live on multiple streams.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. That's great. That's really great. I decided I kind of moved my office setup a little bit because, if I realized for a lot of the episodes, you're kind of seeing me at an angle. So I kind of moved everything around. So now it's right on me.
Nice.
So hopefully it looks a little better. This doesn't improve, but hopefully the other part of it does. And it's so beautiful out today. It's nice and sunny still. So I got my natural light going on.
There you go.
So, imagine we'll be on this and then the sun will go down. But my hope is that I've moved things around here enough that I can just pop lights on and that'll be good to go.
Right yeah. I'm still setting up my new office. I had to rush this morning to get the green screen up because I was recording with Damien. Mm-hmm. And I tried. It took me 2 hours to find the right combination of location and height and everything. Yeah. But I got it going. And then my internet was crap.
Oh,
so
man.
I had to string hard line my computer in from the actual modem. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah, sometimes you just have to, do that. I know that I bought a Wi-Fi extender that's at the other side of my house. Because where I'm at here in my office, I've realized without that Wi-Fi extender, my Wi-Fi is not very good.
Yeah.
So, I have to kind of correct it or whatever.
Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, it is what it is.
Yep, that's right.
So, what could we chat about? I
was just thinking, I think one of the things we might have mentioned was, what the hell was it? Something about what would prisons look like, or what would we do with criminals
that would be an interesting
in a more liberatory society?
That's a great question. So there's a lot to talk about here. We're going to talk about Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete, later in the year. That's going to be in the schedule. And then, I can't remember exactly what the name of it is, what the name of the episode, but as always, I tend to make things about Star Trek. So there's a great Star Trek episode. I'm trying to remember the name of the episode. It's in the first season, and it is kind of a meditation on that, where, let me see if I can find it here, season 1. So let's see. There it is. That's the one I want. Yeah. Yep, that's it. So, so there's a great Star Trek original series episode called Dagger of the Mind that kind of goes into this a little bit. So,
okay.
In this sort of future Star Trek universe, there are these sort of rehabilitation colonies that exist in space, where if you are a criminal or if you're someone who has severe mental health issues, you go to these colonies. Well, what they find out is that in this episode, that this doctor has developed this elaborate way of being able to essentially torture people. And so he sort of says it as a way of, he sort of sets it up as like, well, we're rehabilitating these people, we're helping these people, when in reality, what they're actually doing is sort of lobotomizing them, except for without using pickaxes and electroshock and shit.
They're not sticking a needle up your nose to kill the brain or whatever.
And that episode's really a great commentary on how we as a society, I think at the time, this is the mid 1960s, mental health in the United States was pretty bad.
Right.
It was pretty horrible. It's not much better today. And there's a history behind that.
Yeah.
But back then it was really horrible. A lot of times institutions, they were called state hospitals. Some of them still exist today in the United States. I imagine you guys have something similar in Canada. And they would be these really degraded, awful places. If anybody who has ever watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the great, movie based on the Ken Kesey novel, Jack Nicholson, Um, Louise Fletcher, Danny DeVito, a bunch of people are in it. And that was sort of a snapshot into the way in which mental health facilities were really terrible in the United States. And unfortunately, they're not much better today. So in the 1960s, when Kennedy was president, there was a sort of push for mental health reform. Part of that is because Kennedy had a member of his family, a sister who suffered from mental illness and developmental issues. And so Kennedy's idea, his original vision, or the vision of these policymakers, was these big, massive state hospitals are really horrible to patients. They are often living in horrible, degraded conditions. Let's set up an alternate system of mental health. And so what they did was they passed this mental health reform law in the 1960s that moved most patients away from being in these massive, underfunded, poorly staffed, sort of rotting, huge institutions to having them go into, ideally, these community mental health centers, which would be funded from a myriad of sources. So it'd be local sources, state, like a state of Indiana or whatever, state sources, and then federal sources.
Okay.
Unfortunately, like most things, the idea for this was kind of good on paper. The idea of making these institutions smaller, better funded, closer to the community, reacting to community concerns. Those were all good things that like people were excited about the possibility of them coming to fruition. Right. But like most things you can talk about with the United States, everything kind of went wrong with Reagan. So Reagan gets into office in the 80s and neoliberalism is sort of ascendant, right? And so for the next 40 years, which we've sort of been on this track now, we've seen a massive decline in mental health resources. So this is how we've just had another horrific mass shooting here in the United States in Texas that was done by a neo-Nazi white supremacist. And the one thing that you'll keep hearing from, the governor of Texas, a guy named Greg Abbott, who's a complete jerk and a real terrible human being, basically is like, oh, well, we need to focus on mental health. While at the same time that, the Texas is proposing a budget that cut $200 million for mental health care.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the problem, right? The sort of single largest public institution that provides mental health services to people are prisons in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so when these state hospitals started to close down in the 1960s and 70s, and then really started to skyrocket in the 1980s and 90s, we used to have a massive mental hospital here in Indianapolis called Central State Hospital. It closed in the early 90s. A huge chunk of those people ended up in prisons because they were people who often were not necessarily violent, although some of them were, but often had what's called dual diagnosis, where they were both mentally ill and then also had a substance abuse problem because they weren't being properly treated for their mental health issues. And so today, the biggest deliverer of public mental health care is prisons in the United States. I think that's kind of an indictment of the system. And so this is sort of my preamble to sort of set up, okay, well, what would an alternative look like? What would the alternative look like? And I would say, well, just as a pure reformist measure, let's go back to the idea that happened in the 60s. Let's go back to the Kennedy idea, where we have these robustly public funded community health centers where people can go both for mental health care and for regular health care. This is something that when there was debates over the Affordable Care Act in the early 2010s, Bernie Sanders was a big proponent of these sort of local rural community health centers, and he built a big part of that into the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. And so, because as we've seen in the United States, not only have you had mental health facilities closed down, but you've also seen hospitals closed down, especially rural hospitals or rural health clinics, because there's no profit in those, they just sort of shut them down. And so what would it look like? Because you could have community mental health centers. And then in terms of people who commit crimes, right? So like, I think it's also like getting to just basic questions. How would we as a more equitable society a more egalitarian, non-hierarchical society, what would we define crime as?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Because
so I don't. Yeah.
Well, I just think like what? Yeah, like what is crime if you have like if people's needs are met and they don't have to steal to survive, or they don't have to, sell drugs or sell illegal goods or like work
Right.
on the black market in any way. What does crime even do if it's not like so much of crime is people fulfilling their basic needs, right?
Exactly. Right. This is the classic story of, the Victor Hugo novel, Les Miserables, right? Jean
Mm-hmm.
Valjean steals a loaf of bread and to feed his family, right? And he then is on the run for the rest of his life, goes under a different name, builds a whole life for himself. And there's the police officer who's following him. His name's Javert. And Javert follows him for years and years and years and years and years, until the point where he realizes that Jean Valjean was actually the virtuous man and that his whole life was essentially a waste and a lie. And Javert kills himself. So it's this kind of deep romantic fiction, but as
cops,
cops,
waste your life might be a waste.
But I think that so much of what we consider crime, as you've said, is not really crime at all.
Yeah.
Right. Or they're crimes of poverty, right? Because we live in a system where it's a crime to simply be poor.
Yeah, that's right. Like even just exist on a homelessness without a home is like everywhere you go it's a crime to be there.
Right. That's a recent news story of a young man, I think his name is Jordan Neely, who was killed on the New York subway. He was homeless. Yeah. He was having a mental health crisis. And he hadn't hurt anybody, but he had sort of, not like hurt anyone, but sort of accosted people on a subway train. And this guy who, from what I've read at least, was like an ex-military person, or puts him in a chokehold and kills him. Mm-hmm. And this person's not arrested. This person's not, so, because essentially if you're homeless and you're bothering people who are on a subway train, you, in this system, you're considered worse than the person who murdered you.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's really the question. So I think they're just, so like for me at least, there's certain crimes that without a doubt are crimes, right?
Right.
So
murder's right there.
Is a good example. Like murder, right? Yeah, I'm building up to that, but like murder, right? Murder is obviously like the example of that, right? As a crime, right? Any kind of sexual abuse, I think is a crime, especially if it involves children.
Yeah,
that is absolutely a crime in my estimation. And theft, I think, is kind of a crime. Now, let's get into the question of, well, how do you define theft, right? So theft can, in the United States, for example, more theft actually occurs from the upper class than from the other way around. So if we talk about, say, for example, wage theft, there was a recent story about a franchise of McDonald's where one or two 10-year-old children were working without pay.
Right.
So now we can get into the idea of child labor being a crime, which I think it is.
Yep.
But you can also get into the question if they were doing this without pay. So it's essentially wage theft.
Yeah.
It's theft. I mean, and profit in and of itself is theft. Like, unless you work for a worker-owned enterprise where the profits are democratically sort of divvied up among the workers, then profit is in and of itself theft. This is the part that I always get a kick out of libertarians when they say like taxation is theft. Okay, fine. When you say that, what is the logic behind your saying that? So it's taxes are money that the government takes that it did not earn to pay for other things which you do not choose. Okay, fine. But the big difference between that and, say, profit is that when you pay your taxes, it's up to some level of democratic control. The people who are deciding those taxes are ultimately You can either vote them out, you can protest against them, you can learn where your tax money is going. Like you can get a sense of all of that. In capitalism, you don't get any of that. You know, corporations are private tyrannies. So, you know, how they divvy up their profit is not really up to you to know. And so, you know, if you take the logic of when they say taxation is theft to its conclusion, then profits in and of themselves are theft because it's wealth which people have not earned, which was created by others, and they're taking it.
Yeah.
For simply the reason that they have force behind them.
Yeah. I've often said, like, if you think taxation is theft, like, just wait till you find out about profits. Like, like they're taking the money that you create.
Yeah. You know, taxes are publicly obtained and publicly delivered, right?
Yeah.
It's a public system. Whereas in corporations with profits are collectively created by the labor of the organization, but yet then they are privately divvied up. They are privately distributed to a very small amount of people, generally. So, yeah, I mean, I think that one of the, and I've said this before, but I think one of the filthiest words in the English language is profit.
Yeah.
You know, it is, you know, I don't know if there's a socialist society where profit would be a good thing. My answer is no. You know, because the whole point of profit is it's not to put it back into your employees. It's not to put it back into your business. It's just surplus that you get to use for whatever you want.
Yeah.
And I think that, and it's for a very small amount of people. So, you know, that's where I get into the idea of theft being a crime in the sense that, you know, if you're working for someone and they're not paying you what you're owed, that's a crime. They're a criminal, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so many more billions of dollars are lost to wage theft than to anything the working class could do. This is, I mean, so that's kind of, we think about crime, we think about different types of crime. And then we think about, okay, well, what would a society look like that has, you know, a really, truly functioning justice system? And what that would mean is robust legal protections for the accused, which is part of the way that the English common law system was originally established. It's the way that the United States, in theory, especially under the Constitution, it's supposed to work, right? Yeah. You are innocent until proven guilty. Yeah. That's the way it works. Unfortunately, the way the legal system actually works is it's often the other way around, where you are guilty until you're proven innocent. Yeah. There are people who, when I was working on a project in graduate school about prisons, I met the mother of a young man who had been in Rikers, the horrific island prison in New York City, which, by the way, at least this was what it was a few years ago. If you go on the New York City subway and you look at the map of New York City, Rikers Island's not on it. They deliberately do not include it on maps in the subway.
Interesting.
So that's a very like, so people will draw it where it is, like Rikers is here. And it's a horrific place. Yeah. This young man was accused of a crime, but never convicted of a crime. It was a pretrial detention.
Yeah,
he was there for years.
I was reading something. Rikers is that's one of the things that people don't remember because it's got such a bad reputation. Is that Rikers is a pre-trial detention center. Like it's not an actual prison.
Yes, it's not a prison. It's a pre-trial facility where people are put who are ostensibly innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
Now, I can imagine there are probably some people in Rikers who are bad. Okay. Sure, I'm not going to say there probably isn't, but the vast majority of them are not. And it's so this young man had horrible PTSD and eventually would commit suicide as a result of his experiences. You know, that is effectively a murder by the state, where you are creating a system whose sole basis is brutality. And for what? I mean, you know, whether it's, you know, petty drug offenses, because we can get into the drug war and how obscene that is, not to mention the fact the United States was in on it.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing too, right? We always often talk about like, with Republicans, like or conservatives in general, like every accusation is a confession. Generally, when they are bitching about something or something they don't like, and they accuse the left or liberals or whoever who say they're doing it, they're the ones who are actually doing it. I think it's kind of the same thing with the way that the state looks at criminals. So they'll say like, "Oh, well, you're a drug pusher." Well, the United States, has essentially covered for dictators and drug cartels for years. So like this idea that, the United States is innocent in any of that is absurd, because it's a gangster type of government. I mean, that's
right.
That's the problem of living in modern, global politics, is that most governments are run as gangster states where, what the gangster says goes, and this is, this is Noam Chomsky's idea. And I agree with him. It's this idea that, there sometimes isn't much of a difference between, the president of the United States and a mafia don. There really just isn't. Right. Or a secretary of defense or a secretary of state. Right.
Yeah.
And, because at the end of the day, when we say, might definitely makes right in terms of the way the United States functions. So brutality and violence is built in, right? I mean, I've said this before, like the United States is the most violent society on earth. I mean, in terms of just its sheer brutality, whether it's imperialism, global wars, whether it's, indefinitely detaining people without any due process. And then just mass shootings. The single largest, the biggest creator of death among children in the United States now is gun violence. So, and people can say, well, we can ban the guns, but I'm like, I don't think necessarily always taking away the guns is going to solve it, because at the end of the day, the United States has a deep culture of violence that it has to reconcile itself with. Now, certainly we can make it a lot harder for psychos to get guns, and I'm in favor of that. But see, this idea that if we just get rid of the guns, everything will be better. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because the United States is this weird, fucked up outlier that we have to have that conversation about. And so that's the other thing, is thinking about how do you reform the state or eventually get to the point to abolish it, where the whole goal is to turn over functions that have nominally been given to the state over to the people. And how does that look?
It's not an easy, I mean, that's one of the abolishment of the state, obviously, is one of the things that anarchists have been working on since it was a thing. And it's not, I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but
no.
But I think in general, like more of the anarchists that I know now talk about like first you got to do two things, right? You got to do a social revolution of education, and you also have to do prefigurative building, so that you're building the society you want as well, along like within the society that we're in, right? And then if you eventually become like an actual force, then the state will, like, if you become a threat to the state's power, then it's going to try and crush you. So you need to have guns because otherwise it's going to try and kill you. So
this is, I think, a difficult question for the left, because I think that, I haven't touched a gun in 20 years. Guns are not really my thing.
No.
Having said that,
not a gun guy.
having said that, I feel more comfortable knowing that marginalized people in my society have guns. Because it's going to get to that point, right? I mean, the single largest, factor of terrorism in the United States is white supremacy. It blows everything else out of the water, right? They sold us the fake fear about Islam when the real fear was homegrown white supremacist, neo-Nazi, fascist terrorism.
And it was being radicalized. It was being radicalized by Rush fucking Limbaugh and Fox News.
So absolutely. And mainstreamed. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that I've seen in my own lifetime the Republican Party and the conservative right become increasingly fascistic, increasingly white supremacist. They were always like that, but they used to be able to hide it a lot better to the body politic. They're not very good at it anymore. The dog whistles aren't dog whistles anymore. They're just
exactly.
bullhorns, right? And part of that is we have a media apparatus which bends over backwards for these people. The recent story right now is that that CNN is essentially going to do a town hall with Donald Trump.
Oh, right.
Just a full-blown, town hall. Now, this is a man who today was just, sort of in the civil trial, the E. Jean Carroll trial, was in a court of law proven to have sexually assaulted her and hurt her. So there's that.
Wow.
He led an attempted fucking coup in the United States government on January 6th. And he knew, with prior knowledge of that he didn't win the election. He knew he didn't win the election and he did it anyway.
Yep.
So there's that. Not to mention his own presidency, which was a litany of corruption, graft, and barbarism that culminated in the deaths of 1 million Americans to COVID. So, when you look back on those 4 years, you go, Jesus Christ, how we ever survived any of it is mind-blowing. But then if you keep going back farther, it doesn't get any better because the 8 years of George W. Bush were absolutely horrific, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the 12 years of Reagan Bush 1 were a fucking nightmare. Like it's, and before that is fucking Nixon. So it's this whole, 50, 60
all
years
presidents are war criminals.
are just these terrible fucking people. Who are, who have become the sort of momentary masters of the American empire, because the people who really run the United States aren't Joe Biden and Kevin McCarthy. It's the unnamed CEOs at BlackRock and JP Morgan Chase.
They're the people who donate.
Those are the people who really run the country.
They'll push for legislation and the politicians will carry out what they need. And
pretty much. I mean, look at it, right? I mean, if you need any indication about, we have one political party in the United States that's absolutely insane, and the other one, which is just absolutely not up to the task of fighting it, is the video that recently went viral of the Florida State House where they're fucking dancing in the fucking
I didn't even
Florida
see that.
General Assembly, where they're all doing like I don't know what, but they're doing like the little dance moves together, Democrats and Republicans, after they just pushed, book bans and banning trans health care for kids and doing all this horrific shit. And let's all get together and be nice. This idea of comedy, not comedy, COMEDY, but comity, COMITY,
right,
of sort of conciliation. This is done. Like, we have to get beyond this shit. I'm so serious that, like,
but that's what a civilized country does, right?
This is what a civilized country does. This is where liberalism collapses in on itself, because it never rises to the moment, because it's so afraid that if it grabs more power to try to fight back against fascism, that they won't be any better than the fascists. And it's like,
you're always better than the fascists.
Always better than the fascists. And two, sometimes you have to take a country through a national crisis in order for it to be better on the other end of it. I mean, this is the thing about, today is John Brown's birthday. The radical abolitionist who led the revolt on Harper's Ferry. I mean, he said that the only way that the slavery is ever going to be rendered asunder by this society is through blood, and he was right. He was right. It took a civil war, right? We didn't defeat white supremacy with a nice conversation. It took 4 years and 620,000 dead for us as a society to not only ban slavery for the most part, except for with the punishment of crime. We can get back to that criminal justice component.
Right.
But then also extend equal protections under the law, under the 14th Amendment. The problem is, over the next 50 years after the passage of the 14th Amendment, which is the equal protection clause that's in the Bill of Rights. It's in the Constitution, which was written explicitly to protect African Americans and their newfound civil rights under the system, right? More cases of under the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to protect corporations than they did to protect Black people. Because the 14th Amendment was then broadly defined to essentially define a corporation as a person. And in the United States, corporations have more rights than humans do. That's just the way it's kind of written.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a bigger, broader, even bigger question, which is this, like, how do we get here where these bigger forces are just overwhelming to us all, and we can't seem to, like, move? We can't seem, there's a certain level of inertia that just kind of exists in the body politic, where it's like we can't seem to get beyond stuff that we know sucks, we know doesn't work, that harms people, and yet we still keep doing it because these forces are bigger than us.
Well, that's the whole trouble. Like, I mean, it's been said over and over again, like this is the reason reformism doesn't actually work, right? Like, because these forces are they maintain themselves and they maintain each other. They pretend in some way that they're in opposition, but then they spend all their time like being conciliatory. Well, the Republicans don't, I guess, but like,
no, because they don't have to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Because the Democrats always will. Because
the Democrats always will, and that's what the real owners of the country want them to do. It's you know, and so you can do reforms, and I'm not against any kind of sort of reformism that does make people's lives better.
Do it as much as you can, but
at the end of the day,
faith in it, right?
No, you can't expect us to simply reform our way out of it. I mean, this is big social upheavals have to happen for big changes in the country, right? So like slavery didn't end gradually.
Right.
You know? It happened pretty quickly. It was a mix of the Emancipation Proclamation as a wartime measure, where certain states of the South, slaves were treated as essentially as contraband, so that you could sort of, the Union could take them as a wartime necessity. You know, that was Lincoln's whole idea, was the idea of wartime necessity. It sort of bathed him with a lot of power. And then the same thing when it comes to the reforms of the 1930s, right? These big social upheavals had to happen in order for the New Deal to get us to where we were in the mid 20th century, where you had the most vibrant, you know, healthy economy in world history. Right. And that had its contradictions, but it worked. And for better or for worse, it worked in a lot of ways for a lot of people. And that was caused by massive upheavals, which were pushed forward, much like the abolitionists had done in the slavery era, by the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, the political radicals who were forcing FDR and forcing the system to be better. And, you know, and that's the thing, is I think it's very telling that, like, in the era that we live, where the last two Democratic presidents, Joe Biden and Barack Obama, who came into office at a time of great social upheaval, like serious, great social upheaval. Obama comes in office during the height of the Great Recession. Millions of people out of work, millions are being thrown out of their homes. In an economic calamity that only the country's never really fully healed from. And with Biden, it's the same thing with the pandemic, where it's a even broader, crazier version of that, where he's coming into office not only on the backs of a pandemic, but also of an attempted coup against the government. And those moments are like, these are your moments where you have to decide, like, am I going to be up to the moment, or am I just going to serve the people who own me? And I think in those instances, I think with both Obama and with Biden, to a greater or lesser extent, they did the latter. Yeah. They've, you know, when Biden says I've been the most progressive president since FDR, that's horseshit. Like, that's absolute bullshit. Like, it's just, no one buys that for a second.
Right.
And
like, even if it was true, like, it's still not enough. Like, I don't care. Right?
It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a moot point. And
especially, and especially when on like the state level, you have all these attacks on like bodily autonomy and like trans people and like voting rights
Yep.
because of gerrymandering and like I mean, maybe he's great. Maybe Biden is the most progressive president since FDR, but it doesn't fucking matter.
No, because we're in a situation where the federal government was a lot stronger in the 1930s and 40s than it is today in general. Part of that was because of the New Deal. Part of that was the reorganization of the federal government, that, you know, and the reorganization of the executive, where broader powers were given to the federal government to do things it had never really done before.
Yeah.
In a major way. And, you know, that's what I would argue for. I mean, if anything, I think that federalism has been used as a cudgel to destroy any chances of progress for marginalized peoples for the most part. Now, there are some outliers to that. I mean, I think, if you want to see the sort of foil to the fascist moron Ron DeSantis, you look at somebody like Tim Walz, who's the governor of Minnesota, right? So, they're doing a lot of really progressive reforms in Minnesota. They instituted a free universal lunch program for kids in public schools. Nice. And the other thing they've done recently is they are a trans sanctuary state. So if you come and they've passed broader, more sweeping protections for trans people than almost anywhere else in the country. So the possibility is there, right? With Wisconsin, with Janet Protaskowitz winning the Supreme Court election up there. Now, again, we're talking about marginal differences, but they matter. They do matter to people.
Right. Yeah.
And so, but I think that this idea that we're going to defeat fascism with like voting and placards is bullshit. I mean, it's going to take struggle, real struggle.
Well, and the thing is, it's not like fascists aren't willing to like murder people.
They are.
So you have to be.
They're very comfortable.
Yeah. They're very comfortable with violence. So you can't like be like, oh yeah, but we have to be the civilized ones. Otherwise you're just going to get murdered.
Right. And this is the problem, right? This goes back to Karl Popper's great idea, the paradox of tolerance, where you can become a society that's so tolerant that it ends up eventually tolerating intolerance, where we give quarter to fascists and white supremacists and transphobes and bigots of all stripes. I think these people should be named, and I think they should be shamed, and much more than that. But but at the very least, I think we have to have a real honest conversation about the fact that like the sort of bourgeois sensibilities of the sort of liberal class are not going to cut it. They're just not going to cut it. There has to be not just a political awakening, but there has to be a moral awakening too. There has to be a real moral revolution in the sense that people's values need to change. What do we value as a society? Do we value hierarchy? Do we value inequality? Do we value violence? Do we value intolerance? Are those the things that we want to be? Because in many respects, that's what the United States is.
Right.
That's what the Western countries are. We bathe ourselves in the language of equality and tolerance, and yet we're not that. Like, we don't live up to those principles. I think we let people starve. We have political prisoners. I find it very telling that you have people in the Biden administration fighting for a journalist who's imprisoned in Russia, which more power to you. I think Putin's a despot. And I think that the assaults on the press in Russia are absolutely horrific. But there's none of that for Julian Assange.
Right.
There's none of that for other whistleblowers who have exposed the crimes of the United States. Or
in fact, the U.S. government intentionally will try and track those down so they can charge them with like things like treason and like.
It's like that young kid who did a bunch of stuff. Now, the thing about the young guy who did some leaks from the Pentagon recently was He wasn't guided by morality
No,
like
that
Daniel
was just
Ellsberg, and he wasn't guided by politics like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange.
yeah.
He was just basically saying, "I'm going to do it to show you that I can." And
the way that I
yeah.
heard it framed was that he did it because he was trying to show how cool he was to his Discord buddies.
Basically, yeah.
Like,
It was,
I'm so cool. I got all
I'm
this
so
clearance.
cool, right? And you know, I mean, there are crimes in the United States that we now know because of his desire to basically do the ultimate form of, like, I don't know, not shit posting, but clout chasing. Yeah. You know, but I think that we as a society, you know, we should not persecute whistleblowers. We should celebrate them. Yeah. These are the people who are speaking truth to power, and doing it in very dangerous conditions. Daniel Ellsberg, the great whistleblower who helped get the Pentagon Papers out there and expose the crimes, the lies of the Vietnam War. He's in hospice care. You know, he's entering the last phase of his life, and you know, and he lived to be, I think he's either in his late 80s or early 90s. Like, he's lived a long life, and I feel like whistleblowers should be granted that. I mean, they should be seen as heroes. I think that, you know, I don't think there's any secret too dangerous to be exposed.
I tend to be of the opinion that governments, if they have to exist, should not be able to keep secrets from their citizens. Like,
no, or at the very least, they have to justify why.
Yeah,
like they have to be clear about why they're doing it.
Yeah,
and not just use the auspices of national security.
Yeah, that's
good enough. You need to explain why.
You can just throw anything under the rug and just hide it and call it national security all of a sudden. Like,
it's either national security or executive privilege or whatever. It's part of it is it's that there's always been, you know, a undercurrent within the United States of, you know, people call it the deep state. I don't like that term because the right's kind of poison the well in that. Right. I often just refer to it as permanent government. It's the people who are always there.
Right.
So it is the national security state, right? It's the NSA, it's the CIA, it's the FBI, it's the Pentagon. These are permanent apparatchiks of the government. They don't go away. Whoever's the president doesn't really matter. Like, they are going to do what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, Jackman just recently released a piece about, you know, why isn't there more of a conversation about the fact that a lot of the Proud Boys were FBI informants, which is important. There's been some other really good reporting about, you know, some of the 9/11 hijackers may have had CIA ties. I mean, I think these are legitimate concerns, right?
Yep.
And I don't think it's, you know, and I think these are questions to be asked. I think like just merely dismissing it and saying, oh, well, you're just being conspiracy theorists, it's nonsense. I think it's imperative that we actually ask real questions about what is the government doing in our name? Because
there are conspiracy theorists that are nonsense. And we can dismiss those people, but there's also important questions to ask about the government and the way it behaves.
Right. Especially since, you know, in the United States, at least, since the creation of the National Security Council and the National Security Directives in the late 1940s, that sort of created the permanent national security state that we've lived under in the United States for, you know, nearly 80 years. Mm-hmm. I think that's very relevant. I think in the 1970s, you know, especially after Watergate, you know, there were serious probes into CIA activities. There was something called the Church Committee, which was led by Frank Church, who was, I think, a senator or a congressman. And, you know, they were asking legitimate questions about what was the CIA doing in Latin America? What was the CIA doing in Iran in the 1950s? What are they doing?
Whatever the fuck they wanted.
These coups, right? And asking those questions, because you have to remember, in the mid 1970s, the CIA had only been around for like 30 years, right? It was created post World War II. During World War II, it was called the OSS, and you know, so it hadn't been around very long.
True.
So people could have like that general conversation about like, is this something that a democratic society ostensibly should have? I would argue no. I don't. You know.
Yeah.
Because the CIA is not an intelligence agency. It calls itself that, but what it really is a permanent army for the corporate interests who genuinely own the United States. And so, why intelligence gathering and doing that kind of work can be done through the State Department. Why do we have to have this separate agency to do it?
Right.
That's really that's kind of the other question. So, yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I think the basic question, which is, governments have to justify themselves. They have to say to us why they're doing what they're doing. They have to create legitimacy, but it has to be grounded in reality. It can't just be bullshit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
It can't just be myths. It can't just be like stories we tell ourselves to feel good about ourselves. It has to be like a real question.
Yeah.
And see,
that's always what it is, though, right? Like it's always bullshit. It's always like, oh yeah, but it's in the name of national security. We're fighting for freedom. We're trying to, save our country. We fought, like, the military fights for your right to vote. The reason, right? Like, it's all bullshit. It's all,
it is. Yeah. It's nonsense. It's a myth we tell ourselves to feel comfortable about what we do.
Yeah.
And, and when people say, oh, we're doing this for freedom or whatever, well, there's always two questions. They're so important. Freedom for whom? Yeah. To do what? Those are the two, right? Who gets freedom and what do they want to do with it? Like, those are, I think, legitimate questions, right? Yep. And so for most of the United States, when we say we're fighting for freedom, what that really means is we are fighting for the multinational corporations that own our government to do essentially their bidding so that we can keep the free flow of trade and wealth, capital flowing and natural resources flowing to the imperialist powers. That's the goal. That's the real reason, right?
That's the whole game.
That's why people can make a joke like, dude's face is so oily, the United States is going to invade it. It's that kind of shit, right? So I think it's, if people want to learn more about this stuff, I mean, there's tons of stuff, but Gore Vidal has a couple good essays on this. His essay, The National Security State's quite good, kind of lays out the history of this. Cool. Obviously, Noam Chomsky's stuff is good on this. Michael Parenti's stuff is good on this. Yeah. But there's a ton of people who've written about the problem of, because the thing is, all of these resources that are devoted to war and coups and violence, they don't go to schools. They don't go to hospitals. They don't go to kids. They don't go to they don't go to our marginalized people. They don't serve anyone other than the people who get to profit off of it.
Yep, that's right.
So that's what I mean. It's like, so I think that's a good question for us on the left is, okay, if we are going to build a more open, egalitarian, democratic, horizontal society, an open society, how do we maintain all of those values that we hold dear while not succumbing to barbarism and succumbing to violence? Those are tricky things that I don't think anybody has a clear answer to, other than, as you said before, trying to develop systems of mutual aid and support and governance outside of existing institutions, and then sort of learning from that experience and then trying to build upon it, and then seizing upon an opportunity to take power. I mean, that's, and
Yep. I guess not to derail. I didn't want to derail the conversation earlier, but we did get a comment from Kerrigan on YouTube. They said, "Do you know, Justin, when you will do the episode about the books about the history of Marxism and socialism in the United States?"
Yeah, so we're definitely going to be covering John Nichols's book, The S Word, in the summer, later in the summer, probably sometime in like July. I think we'll probably record that in July. It might be out in July or August. So we're going to do that book. I'm trying to get a good copy of the Paul Bull book about Marxism. But there's also another book we could do called Daniel Bell's I think Daniel Bell's book, Marxian Socialism in the United States, is another one we could do too. So yeah, we're definitely going to do John Nichols's book, The S Word. And yeah,
Cool.
We'll be doing that in the summer.
Very cool. All right. So some random geek says build the new society in the shell of the old. That's the anarchist way of doing it. That's like you say,
That's
like
right.
prefiguration. You build your support community. You basically build a community inside of the old existing power structures. But
and then and that is pretty consistent with Marxism too. I mean that's pretty much it as well, where it's the new society is built in the ashes of the old. So there's that synergy there between Marxism and anarchism. Well, the other thing too, just that was my segue to mention that I think the book's called Revolutionary Affinities. It's going to be a new book coming out. I think it comes out this month. We'll be doing it later in the year. It's another book about the intersection of anarchism and Marxism that we'll be covering.
Looking forward to that.
That's going to be a fun one.
Yeah. There's another book I'm looking forward to coming out. Zoe Baker, Anarcho-Pack, put out her book on the history of anarchism. So
okay, cool.
Yeah, or I'm not sure. It might be only available for pre-order now on AK Press, but it's something.
Okay, cool.
I'm definitely gonna pick it up anyway.
That's cool. Yeah, there are some really great general histories. I just picked up when I went to Left Bank Books in Seattle, the anarchist bookshop. They had a book by George. Anarcho-Pack calls herself an anarchist Marxist. Yeah. And I think there's a certain affinity there. I like that. I think that's good.
I think it's good.
But I got George Woodcock's book on anarchism. There's also another book I think it's called Demanding the Impossible. It's by Peter Marshall. That's about history of anarchism. And awesome. So there are different other histories too. And then obviously we're going to be doing Daniel Guerin's book later this year on anarchism as well.
Yeah. Further proof.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
I agree with that too. I'm very much these days, it's like, I just sort of say I'm a socialist or I'm an anarchist, like not anarchist, but I'm a Marxist. Like,
right.
I'm kind of open to different ideas. My thinking of the subject is, there may be different routes to get there. And I think the more the merrier. I don't necessarily have I'm not as doctrinaire as I used to be. Okay. Some random geek said, I also recommend the essay Rudolf Rocker by Rudolf Rocker of Marx and Anarchism. Cool. Yeah. Rudolf Rocker is somebody I haven't read yet. I would like to at some point. But and then we're going to later on in the year, we're going to read Rosa Luxemburg too. And I think there's a lot of affinity between, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. There's a great Marxist tradition that's sort of non-Leninist, right? So there's Anton Panachek, there's Rosa Luxemburg, Georges Sorel, Daniel Guerin.
Some of the books that Kerrigan has recommended for us are also like I think they're about some of these different kind of looks at Marxism and not and even I thought maybe even different looks on Leninism. For sure. The Marxist-Leninist branch doesn't seem to be the only one of Leninists, right?
No. So there's different takes on Lenin. So there's Anton Panachek's book, Lenin as a Philosopher, or Lenin the Philosopher, where he kind of goes into some of that. We talked about a little bit. That was a little bit in the book we read earlier this year, the Libertarian Socialism book. There's Georg Lukács's book on Lenin, and Lukács was in many ways one of the sort of founding, framers of Marxist humanism, which was critical. I mean, he was a guy who was actually in the emerging, Hungarian Socialist Republic as part of the early Soviet Union, and then he was sort of phased out and forced out by Stalin. So there's him, obviously Sorel. So yeah, there are different reads of Lenin that I think are more interesting than the sort of baked in, sort of tried and true ways of reading it, I guess. I think there are things to learn from it. And I think that, that whether you like him or not, I think Lenin's presence in thinking about socialism is kind of immense, and I think it's important to it's hard to avoid him. I think you have to you have to figure out where you feel about how you think about it, whether you're against him, whether you're for him, or whether you're somewhere kind of in the middle, which is where I think most people lie. I know it's very easy. I know it's very easy to say, well, it's kind of complicated. It's a little bit of both. I know it's kind of easy to say, but life is very complicated and can be very contradictory.
That's I mean, it's kind of cliche because it's true, right? Because things are complicated. Like there is no one answer, size fits all for everything. And
and and there's like different ways of thinking about Marxism. Like you've got G.A. Cohen, the British philosopher who sort of, and him and Norman Garris and others who sort of use analytical philosophy to interpret Marxism. So it's that sort of intersection of, people like, yeah, that's right. Marx himself was also a very complex guy too. He was, he was somebody who, he was seen as being this kind of very stern, kind of angry, mean figure, which he could be. But if you read, stories, and we'll get into this next time when we talk about Fromm's book on Marx, that he was a family man. He loved his children and he cared about he loved his wife. He was, and he, but he also had a illegitimate child with their nanny. So like, it's like there's that too, right? So, but he loved his wife and he loved his family and he cared about his family. And I think it's Eleanor Marx, who is one of his daughters, who said something along the lines of, he could hate so deeply because he loved so profoundly. And I think that's the good way to think about Marx, is the reason that he's so goddamn angry, which is if you lived at the world he lived in, how could you not be pissed?
Right.
Because it came from a deep sense of loving humanity and loving other people.
Yeah.
I think regardless of whatever flavor of socialism you are, or whatever flavor of the left you're on, I think you're guided by a deep sense of frustration and anger about the system in which we live. And the reason that you have that rage is because of your deep empathy and your deep empathy and sense of responsibility to other people, and that's, I think, a crucial part of the left, is that we need to articulate those values in a way that kind of take it out of the right's hands. I mean, we are the party of family values, right? Like, it's not them.
In the sense, that's right. In the sense that you get to care about your family and they should be taken care of.
Like we want to institute universal health care, and we want to give, maternity and paternity leave, paid family medical leave, that we want to, we want to build a society where children are loved and cared for and not seen as mere gun fodder every week in a mall or a school like it is in the United States.
And then also, like, that families can look like whatever you want them to look like. Like
bingo, right? So that families come in different shapes and sizes. I'm the product of, divorced parents. My wife is the product of single parent, single mother. Communism is all about communal care for all. That's right.
Yep.
From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. His or her, or they or them. Yep. Don't want to alienate anybody. And, but that's important. I think those are the values that animate us. And, and I think that sense of love, right? It's the Che Guevara quote that, like, communism comes from a deep sense of love. Or, that sense of wanting to build a better world. And that's true. I mean, I think that we are all guided by love. It's part of, and that kind of language, I think, can turn people off or whatever, but I think it's important. That's why I'm also,
I think it is very important. I think that's also why a person like can get hung up, when somebody has the wrong idea about communism and they think it's all about dictators and it's all about gulags and murder. And you go, well, fuck, that's not what I
Exactly.
believe in. I believe in this caring for everybody. Oh, well, that sounds like communism. Well, how do you reconcile those two things to me?
And I think the way that you reconcile those two things is not running away from its history. I mean, I
Yeah,
think that's we on
yeah,
the left have to reckon with the ways in which systems which purported to be socialist worked and didn't.
yeah,
And that's part of it, right? Is it's articulating a very clear and different vision. I think that's part of why I think um, it's imperative that we do underscore those historical challenges. But we also have to meet people where they are. Like, so for example, if you go to somebody who, you could win them on the issue of like a higher minimum wage or rent
right,
control or
right.
some kind of policy that would genuinely make their lives materially better. But you can't write off people simply by virtue of that they don't necessarily have the correct social views. I mean, in the sense that there are some people who are truly horrible that you're never going to win over, and you shouldn't waste your time on them. But there are a lot of people who I think are confused or ignorant. They just don't know enough. I can tell you from myself, okay, that I almost knew nothing. I mean,
Mm,
literally nothing um, about trans people. I knew nothing until about 10 years ago.
right.
And what really helped me educate myself on it and what brought me to understand it better was being a huge fan of Against Me, the punk band, and Laura
Oh
Jane
yeah.
Grace, who very publicly came out as trans about 10 years ago. And she was she had a full article in Rolling Stone, and they wrote about her, and I went, oh, it was a connection I can make, because sometimes we as humans we're like that. It's harder for us to understand things and sometimes in the abstract. But if we
Yep.
can connect with something that means something to us, we can articulate, oh, I get what you're trying to say now. And I think we need to do that kind of stuff, right? Where we meet people and sort of pick up on something that means something to them.
Yep.
And I've, have I used the wrong terminology? Yes. Have I accidentally mispronounced someone? Without a doubt. I have made those mistakes, and I have apologized for them. And I think that if you come in a spirit of openness, and you come in a spirit of kindness, and say, I don't know, help me be better, help me learn better if you can. And then a
Yeah.
lot of it still has to be on me too, right? It's not enough to just say, help me. Like, no, I need to do the work too, you know?
Yeah.
But I think most people are pretty cool if you're not just a flaming asshole. Like, I
Yep.
think it's most people are forgiving of mistakes and
Yep.
some minor linguistic transgressions if your heart's in the right place.
And that I think that's like the thing with that is it's easy to like not I don't know what I'm trying to say. I've never experienced somebody who's been so pissed off when I've made a mistake that I could not apologize sincerely and have that be the end of it. Right? Like it's when people get defensive.
Right.
It's when you
Exactly.
start saying, "Well, I'm not a racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body." You go, "Dude, you're just ignoring the thing I just said. You're ignoring the experiences of the people that you're hurting."
Right.
Like take that
And
into
people
account.
take it as if it's like a personal slight.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
But
I'm a
I'm a
nice
nice guy.
guy.
Yes. I
Yeah.
mean, but it's imperative that like people who get like defensive, I think people who get like defensive and try to make excuses, they're not helping themselves. Like
No, that's right.
I think that it's better to be in a position of openness and tolerance and kindness. Like those are the values that we as a society we should care about. Like
There's
that's what I yeah.
a
Guns
good
for
a good
guns
comment
for
on
greens,
YouTube.
guns for Marxists, guns for communists, guns for atheists, guns for antinatalists, guns for animal rights vegans. I mean, fine. I mean, that's fine with
Sure,
me.
sure.
I'm very like I'm not one of those people who want to completely and totally ban guns. I'm not like a lot of mainstream liberals.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's imperative that we as a society, I think, have a better conversation about how we want to regulate who can and cannot get guns based on whether they've, committed a serious crime, like they've, like, I don't know, beat their wife or something.
Yeah.
Or, that they could be a real, I mean, that's kind of the issue too, is it's like, if law enforcement really did anything in this fucking country, these mass shootings wouldn't happen so goddamn much.
That's right.
Right? Like, if they were really going after and doing the good police work and investigating and like saying, oh, this person has written like this like white supremacist screed on Facebook, maybe this is going to be a problem, right?
Yeah.
Or like, this person just bought guns. Like, I don't have a problem with like, with like certain forms of gun registries. I know some people are against that, but like, I don't necessarily see where that could be the worst thing in the world. But I can understand where people can be upset. I mean, I get it, right? Like, one of the things people need to remember is, one of the things you'll often hear when people say, "Oh, see, Reagan wasn't that conservative. He supported an assault weapons ban. We did that when he was governor of California because the Black Panthers showed up with guns at State House, Sacramento, right? Like, there's a very clear reason, which is that in this society, when they do, really serious kind of gun bans, the first person people are going to lose their guns are Black people.
Yeah.
Like, it's, that's really the thing that I think people need to like reckon with that question, like reckon with that thought and be like, because that's true. Like, marginalized people are going to be the ones who get their shit taken from them first, because the history of that is kind of clear that usually it's these, it's so
marginalized people with radical politics. It's always,
it's always
the left that's going to face it more than the right,
because at the end of the day, this system will defend fascism, because ultimately fascism is not anti-capitalist.
Right.
I mean, that's really it, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's
the
really
real threat to people in power are the anti-capitalists, the people who are thoroughly critical of the capitalist system and want to build socialism in certain form or another.
Yeah.
And they're the real threat, to the system. So that's why fascism kind of often just gets a pass, because, or we try to make it about like, we try to like psychoanalyze it. And it's like, no, like, just back up and just look at it for what it really is, which is that fascism is what happens when you have untrammeled corporate power and untrammeled governmental power going hand in hand. Yeah. That's what fascism is. It's the complete consolidation of the corporation and the state. And people can talk about like all the different accoutrements that go with that and with fascism, like obviously like rituals and fervent nationalism and, sort of certain racial or ethnic chauvinisms, like all those are part of fascism, no doubt. Yep. But at the end of the day, how was Nazi Germany structured? I mean, you had these large corporate firms that were in bed with the government who got massive subsidies to build, whether it was cars or to build bombers. And, it was a permanent war economy. That was what, when people say, oh, the Nazis were horrible, but they got the economy going. It's like, yeah, because they did that through fucking war and like a command economy where the corporation and the state became completely synergistic. Like that was what they did.
Yeah.
And if you look at how that worked, that's not that indistinguishable from the modern national security state today. It's not. So I think like, so I think that's really the question is I think, people have said that fascism is capitalism in decay, and that's true, but it's also that essential and perfect blending of corporation and state, those two going hand in hand and then being used as an authority against people who are going to challenge that synergy. Yeah. Right. So in the Third Reich, it was the Jews, it was the homosexuals, it was transgender people. It was, it was marginalized groups, right? The disabled, those are the people who were killed in the death camps. It was 11 million people, 6 million were Jews. The other 5 million were prisoners of war, socialists, communists, anarchists, people who are political radicals, because despite being called National Socialism, there was nothing socialist. Daniel Guerin has a good book called Fascism and Big Business. Yes, he does. I've got that on my shelf. I first read about that book in Perenni's book, Black Shirts and Reds, which we covered on the show. Guerin's book, I think, is one of the best books to look at. And so is Perenni's sort of analysis of it in Black Shirts and Reds, because that's really what it is. Because people are like, well, how the hell did fascism happen? It's like, it happened for a variety of different reasons, but a big part of that was the emergence of the corporate state. That's a really core thing, right? And so that's why it's very imperative that, let's say we are going to have capitalism. I would prefer not to, but let's say we do. That's why it's important to have like democratic like guardrails. Like that's the point, is you have to have some kind of democratic control of the system.
If you're going to have capitalism, you have to have a government that can regulate it.
Bingo. You have to have a robust government that understands that its role is to fundamentally be adversarial with capital and not to be. Exactly right. That's Niemöller, the priest, who.
To be clear, my statement was not an endorsement of capitalism or the state.
No. I'm just saying I don't want either. Really, I mean, what I genuinely want is democracy. You know, because that's what it is, right? Like anarchy or anarchism or socialism. What I advocate for generally is a more democratic society, and I don't mean that like in the Democratic Party sense. Like I mean that in a real sense, right? Where not only do you get to vote for the people who make policy, but you also get to vote on, you know, what your salary is going to be. And like you get to vote, like you get to own where you work and make decisions about where you work with others. And then if you have people in positions of authority, that their authority is granted to them democratically and they are held accountable democratically, right? Authority must be justified rationally and democratically. That's like, to me, that's the main goal. And so whatever form that takes is, I guess, not necessarily irrelevant, but is kind of moot in the sense that whatever we want to build, it should be a system where people are democratically held accountable. That's important.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we live in a system now. Yeah. Because we live in a system now where there's almost none of that.
Right.
I mean, you know, because for all intents and purposes, you know, the United States public, you know, the democracy is a bit of a sham. Like it's not really a real democratic system in the way we would want it to be. You know, it's you know, every 2 or 4 years you go in and pick whichever version of the capitalist class gets to rule over you. I mean, there's really no like real democratic participation. And because we live in a system that has destroyed any semblance of social ties, right? Like, you know, this is Robert Putnam's research and others who've written about the decline of social groups and the decline of clubs. The fact that, you know, 50, 60 years ago, there was a very real shot that the company that you work for, the president of your company, lived in the same neighborhood that you did. That's no longer the case. And so I think those are all this part and parcel of this atomization of society and the destruction of social bonds. And that's why you have like young people or people even my age where, you know, I don't go out very often. Like I don't have a lot of friends. Like I don't I don't party. Like I don't really belong to social clubs. Like I don't have that kind of thing in my life. I don't. Right. And part of that is
sit at home and watch TV.
We all sit at home and watch TV, which is and buy shit on Amazon. Like that's the system they want us to be. They want us to be compliant workers and consumers. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Because and that's the way they sell it. That's the way they sell freedom, is this idea of just like, oh, I have the freedom to buy 34 different types of fucking toothpaste, but I have to set up a GoFundMe if I get terminally ill. Like that's, you know, it's stupid and callous.
So some random geek says, I have some friends in meat space and they're cool, but a lot of friends are online friends right now. Hello, friends.
I'm going to be honest with you. This is how, like, maybe I'm like an old man. When I read Meat Space, I was like, Meat Space? Is that
what app is that?
What the hell? What app is that?
Is that some newfangled app? What the fuck is that?
Newfangled app? What the hell is that? You know, because I don't play video games. Like I'm not hip with the kids, so I don't really know. You know, how do you do, fellow children? You know, I got nothing.
IRL. That's what it is.
IRL, right? But yeah, so but anyway, yeah. So like in general, my political thinking has become a lot more ecumenical, where I pull from, there's a lot of good stuff within the sort of liberal social democratic tradition that we should think about. I think anybody who is on the left should read probably the most influential American philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, and that's John Dewey. I think if you're on the political left, whatever stripe you are, I think you should read John Dewey, because I think his idea of a sort of democratic socialist society is enviable. It's something to think about. You think about this idea that like socialism is like this foreign thing and it doesn't belong here. It's like nonsense. Right. Like, there's a rich tradition of American socialism. There's a rich tradition of Canadian socialism. This is this idea that like, it's nonsense, right? Like, when the emerging textile mills in the East Coast of the United States, like in Lowell, Massachusetts, you had the Lowell girls, as they were called, the Lowell women. They were women who often worked in these factories with these textile mills. A lot of them were not married yet, or they were in poverty, and so they was sort of a dual income family. And so you can go back and look at what they're writing, and they're basically saying, like, they're coming to the conclusions all on their own. They're not reading Marx. They're not reading Bakunin. Right. But they're kind of figuring it out on their own, which is that why the hell should I work all day long to make somebody else rich? Why shouldn't I own this too? Yeah. Why shouldn't I get to control this too? And get to decide how I want to work my day? Like, so it's a rich tradition. One we'll talk about when we do John Nichols's book and we do other books in the future.
Very cool. I suppose we should wrap it up. We're over almost an hour 20. So,
okay.
Thanks so much for this. I think we'll try and make this a fairly regular thing. Right? We're
that would be super fun. I would enjoy that. Yeah.
We had a pretty good viewership today, where like it got up to like 7 people watching over various platforms.
Hey, that's great. That's great.
Maybe we'll stream our regular episodes to multiple platforms as well, and
why not? See how that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds fun.
Right on. Well, thanks everybody for joining us in the stream, and I hope you all have a good one.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in for this sort of impromptu stream, one of hopefully the first of many. Oh, what is the book we were reviewing today? Yeah, no book today.
We're
just chatting.
Yeah,
just chatting.
Random casual live stream.
Right casual live stream. But in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about Marx's Concept of Man by Fromm.
Cool. All right. Have a good one.